and thanks for your leadership. I mean, we have so many folks that still deny that climate change is happening and we're in a crisis mode. And I just really wanted to thank you all for your leadership and thank you for being here. I'll grab the next slide, please. I think we're all well aware that a lot of people are watching New York now as we implement our landmark Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. This slide just sort of shows you the goals of the act to sort of ground us all and why the New York Times called it, when the law was passed, the world's most ambitious. And I think the draft climate plan largely lives up to that title and that appellation that the New York Times gave it back in 2019. But I'll just be honest and say that I think everybody understands that the problems that President Biden is having in Washington getting the Build Back Better agenda passed, that's the latest example, I should say, of the stasis that has existed nationally on climate for decades. It's clear the states are going to have to lead. So really no pressure on any of us as environmental advocates, no pressure on all of you as legislators and staffers, but let's all work together this year, because I think New York really needs to blaze this path forward, not only for the nation, but indeed the world. I mean, I think the US is going to have to come back to the next climate conference, the UN climate conference in the fall, with something more than failed Build Back Better. So I'll take the next slide. The conversation now has obviously moved out of the theoretical and out of the legislative space, out of the Capitol, if you will, with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and it's into the public, the level. People are talking about this in the community, not as much as we need. People are starting to understand this, both from our perspective, but also the fossil fuel interests of driving their perspective to people. And the process and timeline lays out a pretty aggressive schedule over the next year for where we go from a draft plan to a final one. I'll just say a couple words about the public hearings. There will be 6 in-person public hearings. They haven't been scheduled yet for what I hope is obvious reasons, because we're just not sure as a council as when we can do it safely, but there will be a commitment to hold at least 6 in person. So the common period is to last at least 120 days. It's likely to go longer. And there will be virtual versions of the hearings as well to accommodate as many voices as possible that can help us improve the climate action plan. So as we start to go through, I'll take the next slide. It's from my perspective as a member of the council, but also just as a climate advocate, it's now time to win the wins that are already in the draft climate plan. Don't know if we can advance the slides. This is good. Stay here, please. And, there are things in here that are great that we need to win and solidify and perhaps legislate on in this current legislative session to lock things into law. And there are things in the plan that we, quite frankly, need to get rid of. These are provisions that have already been pointed out by the Climate Justice Working Group as already out of alignment with the equity goals of the CLCPA. So we need to get rid of them. The benefits are huge, and the cost of inaction is pretty startling. Let me just underscore that point. If New York State fails to act and adequately implement the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, it will cost us more money than if we act. The delta here is $90 billion. So it's $90 billion more expensive if we fail to act than if we act. And the climate plan sort of lays out these aggressive benefits, which you can see on the chart are pretty tremendous. It's about improving public health. It's about improving our communities that are being devastated with each extreme weather event that seem to be happening almost like on a bi-weekly basis lately in every season. The benefits flow from policies like in the plan, there's 100% of fossil fuel free buildings. The plan contemplates that beginning for residential sector as early as 2024. That's less than 2 years away. We know Governor Hochul has introduced some legislation in the budget to accomplish this, but the plan looks at contemplating that all single homes in New York and all multifamily residences under 4 stories, that they'll be free of fossil fuels, the new ones that is, starting in 2024. So it's a pretty aggressive timeline. And also on vehicles, that 100% of new vehicles will be zero emissions starting with 2035. That's by virtue of not only the plan's ideas and goals, but it's also because of the legislature taking action last year, passing a bill that was just a chapter amendment went through earlier this week. But the legislature looked at where the industry was going and looked at where this transportation sector needed to be, and you acted last year, and we applaud you for that. That's wonderful. Now we have a law that is a statutory obligation on manufacturers of equipment, manufacturers of cars and trucks and buses, that it all has to be zero emissions starting in 2035. That seems like a long time away, but it's not. It's right around the corner. So I'm going to start to go through the different sectors here real quickly to give you a real high-level highlight of some of the real positive aspects as we start with buildings. So Tiana, I'll take the next slide. As we start with buildings, and then we'll work through the sectors really quickly. And then I'm going to turn it over to the policy team that is with us today, and they're going to start to go through some of the plan from what we can start legislating perspectives. So on buildings, the key here is it's our biggest sector of pollution. Most people thought going into this plan that it was going to be transportation, but when you adequately account for methane leakage and natural gas in buildings and everything that happens along the supply line, buildings are actually our biggest source of pollution. And it's something we have to work really fast on. So I really encourage us to be thinking about legislating this year to lock in some of the provisions that will transition this building sector off of fossil fuels. I'm also going to highlight here that there is a section in this part of the plan. There's a concept in this section of the plan that needs to be removed because it's inconsistent with other parts of the plan. And this is namely that there was a thinking when the building sector made their recommendations to the council that we could somehow harness gas that wafts off from the agricultural sector, from landfills and wastewater treatment plants, that methane that wafts off there, capture that, build out new fossil fuel infrastructure to deliver that to buildings elsewhere. So think of like an agricultural operation upstate that has a lot of methane from manure, capture that, build out new pipelines and send it through the system. Well, elsewhere in this plan, we talk very clearly about decommissioning, strategically decommissioning the natural gas infrastructure over the next 30 years. So using that gas in buildings is inconsistent with other parts of the plants, and that needs to be changed. That's an example of, hey, we're moving really fast, but there's some things that need to be fixed. I'll take the next slide, please. And on the transportation sector, just like buildings, it's our second largest source. There really is no time to waste. This is a notoriously hard sector to transition. The new law that's on the books will help us, but I want to give you a stat that comes out of the transportation sector. Right now, the amount of vehicles on New York's roads that are pure electric is just 0.5% of the total vehicles that make up that sector. The plan says that if we want to hit our 2030 goals of cutting half the pollution from this sector, from all of our emissions, we need to get to 1/3 of all vehicles on the road. That's not 1/3 of new vehicles. That's 1/3 of all the vehicles on the road have to be zero emissions, which is primarily electric right now, in less than 8 years. So I'll take the next section. This is about the electricity sector, and this is an easy one in the plan because it's pretty straightforward. The legislature really was smart in basically putting in statutory obligations of where we need to go by 2030 and where we need to be by 2040. But again, no time to waste here because a lot of other pieces of the plan, the transportation sector, the buildings, and as I mentioned in a minute, industrial, they all are dependent upon us making sure that 70% of our electrons generated in 2030 are from renewable energy sources. That's 70% of our electricity sector that have to be renewables by 2030. Again, that's less than 8 years away. And I want to drive a key point here is that there's a little bit of confusion around this issue, and I don't know why. And there's the industry is trying to amend the law now because they believe that the standard for 2040 being zero emissions, well, that's zero carbon pollution. Let me dispel that myth for you all here. The legislature contemplated that issue in 2019 and rejected it. Governor Cuomo at the time proposed legislation that would have the sector being carbon-free by 2040, and the legislature said no. And the final bill that was negotiated with the executive in 2019 says that this sector will be zero emissions by 2040. So this issue's been already adjudicated, and those that are trying to push this issue again in the legislature are just looking for another bite of an apple where they already lost it. I'll take the next slide, please. Kate's going to get into, where we can legislate on this issue this year, but I got to tell you, this section is one of the best in the plan because it really identifies where we need to go with solid waste. For the first time, it says we're going to be looking at waste that is not a byproduct, but we're looking at waste from a lens of better materials management. So that means less of it, and that means that when we do less of it, in terms of food waste and composting for food waste and other organics, in terms of packaging that makes up a huge volume that goes into our landfills right now, all of that gets removed from the stream. So landfills become a infrequently used disposal option by 2050. And I also want to just say that going back to electricity sector, zero emissions does apply to waste to energy or garbage burning facilities. So I'll take the next slide here. And this is an important sector, but it's not the biggest sector in terms of New York. But what's really key here is we have to hit our mark when it comes to generating 70% of our electricity with renewables so that we can move into electrify key sectors of our industry. So to truly address all these different issues, one, it's going to become more efficient. Two, we have to look at exploring how to way to decarbonize the fuels. But really what this sector is about is electrification, and those electrons have to have zero emissions attached to them. I'll take the last slide in my section anyways. Thanks, Tiana. I really appreciate your work moving through these slides. The agricultural sector, unlike the waste sector, is probably one of the ones I find the most disappointing. And I think it flows from the leader of the panel, which was the Ag and Markets Commissioner, incorrectly thought that he had a table target that was only cutting emissions from the sector 30%, when the law clearly says that 85%. So there aren't a lot of good, strong recommendations or standards in the ag sector. It's an important one for New York State. It's largely tied to livestock, as this slide indicates. One thing that I mentioned earlier for buildings, it contemplates capturing the methane from manure operations in our livestock emissions, and then building out fossil fuel infrastructure to ship that elsewhere. Myself and leading scientists also appointed by the Assembly to this panel, Bob Howarth, knows methane better than probably anybody in New York State. We recommend that you capture this methane on site and use it for electricity generation on site through non-combustion means. And what you can do is basically see if this could be methane, which is a hydrogen carrier, could be a great source for hydrogen fuel cells locally in the agricultural sector. It's so inefficient and so wasteful, and it builds out infrastructure that is going to be filled with fracked gas over time. Best thing to do is capture on site and use it there. But this section of the plan doesn't even talk about that. It talks about capturing it and sending it to New York City to be combusted in buildings there, which we know is not going to happen now. So, and also there could have been a better understanding of how we capture that last issue of nitrous oxide, which is a big greenhouse gas, and it's related to nitrogen fertilizer. This plan should have a recommendation that we put a fee on the importation of synthetic fertilizers into New York. New York State has the lowest fee of any state in the country here. It would be a twofer. One, we could generate revenue to support paying farmers to get into regenerative agriculture. And two, by making synthetic fertilizer more expensive, it would serve as a disincentive and thereby lower nitrous oxide emissions. So listen, I just blew through a 300-page report in about 10 minutes. I really appreciate you guys listening to the presentation, and I'm looking forward to hearing the staff as they run through what we can start legislating on. So I'll turn it back to Joshua, and you can introduce our next speaker.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter. So Connor Bambrick is our Director of Climate Policy. I believe many of you know him, and he is going to cover the next section, doing a deeper dive into policy recommendations around buildings. So I will hand it over to you, Connor.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you, Peter, for the presentation. I think, as Peter mentioned earlier, the sections were to are areas that we've identified within the plan where we feel that the legislature start moving immediately. And you'll see throughout the next couple of slides some examples of legislation that's already been introduced, and some concepts that are within the plan that we feel could move forward. So I'll start off with buildings. The plan has a recommendation of to electrify all new construction starting in 2024 for low-rise single-family households, homes, and then all Senator Kavanaugh and Assemblymember Gallagher have introduced legislation that would start this process in 2024. The governor has proposed in the budget to electrify all new construction by 2027. So we're hopeful to see some movement there this session, possibly a compromise, or but we really are behind the bill that's been introduced. A second big piece, one of the biggest pieces in the on the building side, it would be legislation to update our energy building codes and appliance and equipment efficiency standards. This is a bill that was passed by the Senate last year. It's carried by Senator Parker and Assemblymember Fahey. Again, another example that the governor has also put forth in the executive budget. So we're hopeful to see progress on that this year. We encourage members to co-sponsor this legislation, and hopefully we can get one of the bigger recommendations on the building side is to require the sale and installation of zero emissions equipment for heating and hot water when it reaches its end of life. So the concept we're talking about here is you have an existing piece of equipment, say a hot water heater in your home. When that sort of reaches the end of its lifespan or is about to fail, you're going to make a purchase to replace that. And at that time, there would be a mandate that that purchase would be a zero emissions solution. Next slide, please. Here, thanks, Janice. So here are a couple of recommendations that are sort of connected to the building sector around infrastructure. There's one proposal out there that would, that currently there's a requirement right now that the Public Service Commission and utilities have to serve gas to utility applicants. That sort of creates confusion around the Climate Action Council's zero emission plan here. So there's legislation right now that would simply remove that requirement and require all the utilities to come up with plans and submit them to the Public Service Commission as to how they're going to meet the emissions-free electricity mandate, as well as the emissions reduction goals. Carried by Assemblymember Engelbright and Senator Kaminsky. Another concept that is being put out there, and I understand is under development with Senator Krueger, Senator May, and Assemblymember Fahey, would direct the Public Service Commission and all the other relevant agencies and authorities to develop a plan to come up with a just and equitable transition off of the gas infrastructure. This is recognition that we're going to have to wind down on gas service, and then also a recognition of the need to make sure we're not burdening people with stranded assets. So as we're winding it down, we want to make sure we're doing it thoughtfully so that households that get decommissioned last aren't stuck footing the bill for the entire system. Recommendations here is quite simply to just eliminate any incentives that we have out there right now that would encourage new purchases of gas equipment. And these are incentives that are offered by utilities or by NYSERDA. Let me turn it over to Amanda Sachs.
Thanks, Connor. And Amanda Sachs is our legislative and climate associate. And please go ahead, Amanda.
Thank you, Joshua. Hi, everybody. Like Peter said earlier, transportation is the second largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State. New York can achieve its emissions reductions goals through the sector by rapid zero emissions vehicle sales requirements and incentives, historic investments in expanded public transportation, enhanced bike and pedestrian infrastructure, and smart growth development. So here are some of the concepts in the draft plan that can be legislated. Most of them deal with light duty zero emissions vehicle adoption. One of our favorites is the FEBATE program, which would offer direct rebates for electric vehicle purchases, supported by imposing a fee on gas-powered vehicles. This makes EVs more cost competitive. The program can be designed to be revenue neutral and can incorporate other policy goals like higher rebates for low and middle income consumers and exemptions for from the fee for lower priced vehicles purchased largely by low and middle income consumers. FEBATE should be applied to new car sales, but there can also be an additional rebate for used zero emissions vehicles targeted toward low and middle income consumers. And this can be paired with affordable financing options. There is the vehicle registration fees, which has the same premise as the FEBATE. It would establish a system of registration fees that would discourage the purchase of more carbon intensive vehicles. The fees could vary based on emissions intensity and should be accompanied by incentives for lower emitting vehicles. There is also a recommendation that would expand direct to consumer sales of zero emissions vehicles by manufacturers, which would increase the availability and sales of zero emissions vehicles across the state. This concept has been legislated by Assemblymember Fahey and Senator Kaminsky, and the ability of zero emissions vehicle manufacturers to sell directly to consumers would remove an existing obstacle to the sale of these preferred vehicles. The plan suggests legislation that establishes procurement and contracting rules to increase the percentage of zero emissions equipment and vehicles used for state-funded projects. And this can be aligned with the state's November 2021 commitment to converting 100% of public medium and heavy duty fleet vehicles to be zero emissions by 2040. Incentives for EV charging stations are expected to be needed primarily over the next 10 to 15 years as the market for zero emissions vehicles reaches its maturity. So the state is going to need rebates and direct investments in charging stations for the foreseeable future. There are a lot more recommendations in the transportation section that do not explicitly state that they should be legislated, but they can be, and we are happy to have conversations at a later time about all the foreseeable paths forward to legislating aspects of this plan, as well as additional ideas that didn't make it into this draft version.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I will now pass it over to Kate Carrera, who's our Deputy Director at EA, and she will cover the waste section.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. So yes, in terms of the waste section, it is a really well written chapter. There's a lot there, and there's a lot that's actually already being proposed by a lot of members that are on this call today, dealing with a number of these issues. The report definitely, and Assembly Member Epstein and I have been chatting in the text about this as well. There is a very heavy emphasis on the report on the diversion of organics. Does not necessarily specifically lay out the mandatory municipal programs, but I don't understand how you can get to a significant reduction in disposal of organics without requiring a municipal program. So I think one of the recommendations specifically calls out the food donation scraps recycling law that was passed in 2019 to expand that. There are some limitations on how far a facility can be to a generating facility can be to a processing facility. I think statewide composting has to be part of that solution. The next kind of aspect they talk about, the plan talks about, is this reduction, well, actually, I would say elimination, reduction, and reuse legislation. So in addition to legislating in areas where we can actually eliminate the use of certain single-use plastics, for instance, there's a number of proposals in the legislature on these items, plastic straws and cutlery and all, and those types of pieces of legislation. There's also needs to be legislation that encourages kind of the reuse of products as well as setting post-consumer content goals for products. These all kind of work hand in hand. I think one of the big messages from the report is that reduction is extremely important. We need to be putting less things into the landfills. As Peter mentioned, landfills will be the last option, and it's always been the last option on our waste hierarchy. Although we've kind of lost sight of that. And if folks recall, the first aspect of a waste hierarchy is to reduce. So really focusing on legislation that reduces the amount of trash we're creating in the first place. So thinking about unnecessary or items that can be kind of eliminated, as well as the next step going to how do we promote reuse and repair of products before they get into the waste stream. And then the other aspect is recycling, which is incredibly important, but again, seems to have gone higher up on the we seem to go from recycling as being the main solution, and it's not. Recycling is important for helping take some of the waste and take some of the taking products out of the waste stream and making them into other products. And that's where extended producer responsibility and bottle bill expansion comes in. And so those are two really larger pieces of this kind of plan. And in the executive budget has a piece on paper and packaging, which is also legislation that's been promoted in both the House and the Senate last year. And the draft scoping report also kind of identifies EPR for those products, but also for a number of other products that have significant GHG impacts. In particular, an EPR program for solar panels or wind turbines, mattresses. We have an EPR program in legislation right now for carpets, and I've actually and I'll send this as part of a follow-up, outlined where all the different pieces of legislation that are kind of out there existing as being introduced fit into each of these buckets, because there is quite a bit, because I know members, this is a really important issue for members, and there is a lot out there, but they all kind of need to be pieced together to really fit this puzzle. And the report does a nice job of kind of outlining how these different diversion, reduction, and extended producer responsibility fits together. I think I'll leave it at that and then answer questions, Josh, because I want to be sensitive to our time for questions.